Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here today in this afternoon for another webinar from the Interconnect project. So today we will have our presenters here talking about new business models with household assets with an impact on cybersecurity and data ownership, and sharing with us today here the experiences of an industry-grade solution provider. So we will have our colleagues from Engie and ENGIE-tiko, which is a company related to Engie, sharing their expertise and their experiences with us on this topic. So this is basically a very important topic, which is common to us all as users. And we'll be discussing here today the value of information and the way the information is used to create new services and new fronts for industry and service providers. So today with us here we have Morgan Perani, Remi Roche, and Tony Sulankivi. Morgan is a marketing project manager at Engie Home Performance. So she's focusing on developing offers and optimizing customer journeys in the projects in which Engie Home Performance is involved with. Then we'll have Remi that's working with ENGIE-tiko as solution engineers with a specialization in energy management solutions to talk also about the role of ENGIE-tiko in the project, and most importantly, the focus that it's being held in the French demonstrator, where he will be able to share some of their thoughts on the implementation. And then the final part will be Tony, that will be discussing the more technical aspects on the cyber and network communication sides concerning security and the share of information within domains. So he's a professional with more than 14 years of experience that covers different domains, different scales of mission critical infrastructures, both in private and governmental sectors. We will see more and hear more about all of our speakers in the next minute. So thank you very much for attending. Just to remind you that you have the opportunity to interact with us via the Q&A. So feel free to pose your questions on the Q&A. Please do not use the chat. And at the end, we'll be having the opportunity to go through the questions that you introduced throughout the session, and to have the speakers answering to them, and whenever necessary, to have you intervening directly in the session by raising your hand, so we can unmute you and have you live in the session, raising your questions and intervening jointly with us. So I hope that you appreciate this session, and again, thank you very much for our speakers and for the audience for joining us here today. So I'm passing on the floor to Morgan, that will make the other introductions from the Engie side. So thank you very much. Morgan, please.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I will start the presentation by introducing Engie and ENGIE-tiko roles in the Interconnect project. Engie is an energy and service provider with more than 170 employees worldwide, and Engie raison d'être, purpose, is to accelerate the transition towards a carbon neutral economy. Engie is one of the largest renewable energy producer in France in 2020, and is a major player in the B2C market for the energy transition in France, committed to helping its individual customers to consume less and better. In Internet project, Engie is working with the French pilot partners to test, among the other use cases, a dynamic pricing offer associated with monitoring and flexibility while developing equipment interoperability. In 2019, ENGIE-tiko joined the Engie Group. ENGIE-tiko is a Swiss-based smart home energy management and TSO-grade flexibility solution provider. In the project, ENGIE-tiko will provide their energy management system and flexibility solution. And now I will let Remi introduce briefly ENGIE-tiko and move to the first part of the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Morgan. So ENGIE-tiko is a company that was founded in 2012, and that uses hardware and software to control household assets, such as central heaters or coolers, water boilers, EVs, batteries, and PV. So to control these assets in order to provide different services. So our two main services are home energy management system. So we offer a service to the end customer to save energy and to make savings on their energy bill by changing the energy patterns or by shifting the consumption to hours where the PV production is producing. But we also are able to control the devices as a pool and offer flexibility with the virtual power plant to our partners. So our first virtual power plant was created in 2014 in Switzerland, where we were able to offer the secondary power control service to the Swiss TSO Swissgrid. And then in 2016, we were also certified to offer primary frequency control, so an ancillary service to help regulate the grid. In 2018, we also offered primary frequency control, but in Germany with batteries. And now in 2020, we offer a wide range of energy trading services to our partners, so energy suppliers and also system operators, so in France, in Austria, in Switzerland, and in Germany. So in the scope of the Interconnect project, ENGIE-tiko wants to combine with ENGIE the flexibility offer of our virtual power plants, so the services that we already offer, with our energy management system with a new feature, which is dynamic tariff. So dynamic tariff has a goal to reduce the bill, to lower the bill of the consumers by shifting the consumption to periods where the tariffs are lower. So the goal is to do that in for the end customers' homes while offering services to the grid. But as we move with solutions that are able to control a lot of assets and to control household assets, comes the question of privacy. And so as this article from Reuters quickly summarizes, it's a good read, the customers can have some concerns about offering sharing their consumption with a provider to offer services to the grid or to offer services as like a virtual power plant. And so some of these concerns can be that the customer are afraid that the aggregator uses their data to see the pattern of their use, to see which appliance is used when, to determine their location and other details of the household and sell this data. So they are afraid that this data is sold for marketing purposes, but also for other purposes that they don't think of. And so in order to mitigate these concerns, we, as ENGIE-tiko, believe that it's really important to be transparent with the end user, and that it's really important to take privacy as a #1 issue and a #1 concern. Before going forward, I will quickly tell you about some definitions that we use in terms of privacy and data ownership. So first, we talk about the data subject owner. This is the person to whom belongs the data. So for example, an end customer in a household, and their personal data is any information that is related to the data subject owner. So it can range from the name, address, to IP address, email, but also some data that may not look like personal data, but zip code, birth year, everything that can help reconstruct the data or identify the data subject owner is personal data. We also call that personally identifiable information, or PII. Then there is the data controller. So the data controller is the legal person or agency that usually has a contract with the data subject owner and needs the PII to establish a contract or provide a service. So in a common case, it's an energy provider that needs this data to have a contract with the end customer and to bill the end customer and provide support to the end customer. Then there's the data processor. It's an entity, so it can be a public authority or an agency that uses the data provided by the customer or created by the customer. For example, in the case of energy consumption data, use patterns and stuff like that, that uses this data to provide a service. So this service can be a home energy management system, so algorithms that help the customer save energy and increase their savings, or also services to offer flexibility to a third party, for example, transmission system operator or a grid operator. So these services fall into the category data processing. So data processing is any operation or set operations that uses the personal data to provide a service for the end customers or a third party. So in the example of ENGIE-tiko, first, we need to install our hardware in the customer's home. So we sell this hardware through the energy supplier. So the energy supplier has a contract with the end customer. So they share the PII to establish this contract. But then the PII are also used to install the hardware, because the installer needs to find the home, needs to understand where he is installing the hardware. And the data is also used during support. If there is a problem during the installation, we need this data to know to whom we are talking and where everything is happening. After the installation, PII is still used for services for the customers. So the data controller, so the energy supplier, uses the PII to provide support to the customer. So if there is a problem with the installation after the first intervention, or if the customer has questions, they need PII to identify the customer when they talk to them and be sure that they can assist them the best. But PII is also used in the service. So ENGIE-tiko provides a web area and a smartphone app to the customer, and the customer wants to find their personal data on it. So their email, their address, everything is in the parameters. But to be able to provide that, ENGIE-tiko needs to have access to this data. And then finally, the other service that ENGIE-tiko provides is the flexibility, so with the virtual power plant. And for this, we don't need the PII. So for this, we need to only aggregate the consumption of the people and activate or deactivate devices, but we don't need to know exactly where we activate or deactivate the devices. We don't need to associate this data to the personal data. So we can here separate the data and make sure that they are not identifiable. And we do that by separating our data in different databases. And we believe that it's a good practice in the industry to do that. So everything that is measurement data that is, let's say, created by the user by their devices and that is used for the services is in one database, so the measurement data database. And this is separated from the personal database by mapping. So here, if we talk about devices, it's a table with device IDs that connects the measurements to the people, so that any operation done on the measurements for a VPP application, for data analysis, it's completely separated from personal data. And so we can erase personal data if the customer wants to, according to GDPR laws, without impairing our measurements data database or our operation. So the personal data is used only for customer support, for the customer app, and for the installation. And then the measurements are used only for the services, but there is a clear cut between the two. But even if we do that and protect the data as much as we can, there are still some things that we have to be careful about. So even if we believe that our system is completely secure, it's the best practice to collect as minimum amount of any personal information as possible, because if we don't need this information for support to the customer, why would we ask it? So we believe that we need the minimum amount of any personal information, and that we shouldn't ask for any information from the customer that is not needed. And also we need to anonymize the data as early as possible. This means if the data is not needed for a service, for example, for the virtual power plant, we should anonymize it or not use it in order to make sure that the people who work on this service don't have access to the personal data. As presented before, we want to store the data separately and securely so that if the measurement database is used or compromised, it does not compromise the personal database and it's not linkable, except if you have the mapping and both databases, so if everything is compromised, so that it's more secure. And going back to point one, we want to not to collect data that is seemingly anonymous. So for example, date of birth, gender, or zip code can feel like it's not related to the customer. I mean, it's related to the customer, but can feel like it cannot be used to identify the customer, but put together with other data, and it could. So we have to be careful with that and not collect it if we don't need it. And then, as Tony will present afterwards, the most important is to have good cybersecurity practice to make sure that this data is protected against internal and or external threats. So in our case, an example with our virtual power plants and our clients, which are usually energy suppliers like Engie, the client wants only one end-to-end secure system, and they want only one point of responsibility. So in our case, that would be us, Tiko, and we want to have only one point of failure possible. The issue with the interconnect project, I mean, not issue, but the challenge more so, is that with interoperable components from different stakeholders, it is complicated to define one responsible entity for cybersecurity. And so it's really important to discuss that from the beginning in order to make sure that the solution and the interoperable platform is secure and does not leak personal data. A good way to protect the data is to have audits by third party in order to make sure that the security is the best and that we don't fool ourselves by thinking that we have a good solution and did not see something missing. So just before letting Tony go to his part, I think we will first ask you some questions.
So thank you, Remi. I think the polls are still running, but I think I can continue. So continuing from the privacy topics, I have three areas which I would like to cover. So the first one is the aggregation and the cloud aggregation mainly from the VPP perspective. So the risks what we see happening on that area, and not directly only related to the VPP, but the general aggregation of high energy capacity assets. The second part is the understanding the risks of the public internet. So from the point of view using the public internet for connectivity, for doing this aggregation of energy assets, and other parts which you might need to consider when you're dealing with public internet. And the last part is the home network threats, which has had a lot of evolution as well, a lot of growing, and the number of devices have been growing in the home networks, and this I will finish the presentation. So before I go into these topics, just a little bit of background. I used to work, before I joined ENGIE Energy as the head of cybersecurity, I used to work in a nuclear power plant, so actually securing nuclear reactors. And for me, nuclear power plant is quite a traditional construction from the IT and the security perspective, and it's quite not only evolutionary step, but I would say like a revolutionary step from conventional power plants to a virtual power plant. So the same principles that have been used to protect the conventional power plants like nuclear power plant or a coal plant doesn't necessarily work in a virtual power plant. So the virtual power plant is a decentralized capacity, when as the conventional power plant is usually just the one source, and you try to build very strong barriers around that, and you usually want to also segregate that and the operational technology parts, the critical and the safety components, as much as possible from all the untrusted networks and other networks. Whereas the virtual power plant usually has a lot of connections to different networks, including the internet. So it's a little bit of different approach what you need to use, how to actually secure this, because you cannot build same kind of barriers around your virtual power plant that you can build around the conventional power plant. And the usual ways how you secure the conventional power plant like nuclear power plant is that you use lots of air gaps, you use lots of data diodes to actually build these more barriers around your critical components, and with the virtual power plant, it's more like it's more dynamic, it's scalable, it's changing all the time. It has to be dynamic in order to work. So these kind of similar static controls that can be put around the conventional power plant doesn't work the same way in a virtual power plant. And one of the characteristics with the conventional power plants that it's still very common to see even use of Windows XP or some very old operating systems in a conventional power plant. And what you try to do is that you just try to make sure that no one ever gets their hands, or any digital malware cannot get into that device. But with a virtual power plant, you live with constantly updating and changing environment. You have these DevOps and software-driven worlds, and you need to be continuously updating and patching the environment. And there is lots of old models what you use in conventional power plants. One of the models, security architecture models, is the Purdue model. It's over 30 years old almost, so it's kind of like traditionally used in conventional power plants, but there is no reference model for virtual power plants yet. We in ENGIE-tiko, we are trying to develop this kind of new reference architecture model for virtual power plants, and there's lots of different things happening around the world, but there is no one single reference architecture that how on a high level you want to secure the virtual power plant, because there's so much different things and aspects in virtual power plant than in the conventional one. Just quickly showing kind of like the high level concept of virtual power plant and the EMS, which is usually running very closely with the virtual power plant. You have the grid network where you have the high voltage and the low voltage operators, usually in the role of TSOs and DSOs. Then you have the grid connection to your households, to your energy assets, solar panels, EV chargers, batteries, boilers, so forth. And what we use ENGIE-tiko, where we build our devices ourselves, we have the sensors, which are actually sensing the environment in terms of, for example, temperatures. And then we have the actuators, which are switching on or off the devices based on the demand and the control you want to have on those. And then we have a gateway, which is collecting and combining these sensors and actuators and then communicating through either the private mobile network using a SIM card, the central cloud, and to the aggregation point, or the other option, what we use, that we also have the option to communicate over the public internet. And this is something which I will talk later a little bit regarding the public internet connection. We do not recommend that for large-scale operations because there is some risks that are increasing when the capacity of the power plant grows, but there is still an option for us to use the internet as well. And then we have the connection to the grid operators, where we share the monitoring data for the VPP, and then we can receive the control signal depending of the demand on the grid. That's how do we want the VPP to operate. And then we have the portals, which are segregated from the actual operation of the VPP, including the sensitive personal information. And we have the portals where we serve our EMS customers also over the public internet, obviously. So regarding the aggregation, what we see currently, and there has been a lot of communication, good communication on European Union level as well, that there is this aggregation, distributed energy resources, DER aggregation happening currently. And one example of this one, which is quite, I think, easy for everyone to understand, that for example, end of 2020, there was around 2 million electric vehicles only in Europe alone, and that doesn't even include the plug-in hybrids. So there is already 2 million, and I think that the number is probably doubling for the next few years. So we already understand that, let's say, for the sake of an argument, that out of those 2 million vehicles, maybe 1 million of them is currently or constantly connected to the grid with a cable or through the EV charger. So what? And if we think about that even a single manufacturer might be a big portion of those 1 million cars. So what would happen if someone would gain a control of this pool of these EVs, these electric cars, and all of a sudden tell that these cars start to charge from the grid? If we have even 1,000 electric vehicles which could charge for 1 kilowatt of power, that would already generate a load of 1 gigawatt of power. So that's already something that would actually destabilize possibly the grid. So these are the kind of aggregations what we are seeing around us happening, and this is something that these aggregations are not directly related to the virtual power plants, but this is something what is happening because the world around us is evolving, and this is something that there is currently no regulatory requirements around this, so there is no manufacturer maximum limits that how much of these high energy assets like electric vehicles you can aggregate. And so this is kind of like the world is changing so quickly, so that the regulations is coming always a little bit behind the changes what we are seeing. A good example of these kind of changes, which is not directly related to the aggregation, but I think 2 weeks ago in Iran there was a power blackout because of the crypto mining. Most of you probably know that the crypto and the big Bitcoin prices have going up quite a lot. So 2 weeks ago, only the crypto miners caused 450 megawatts of power consumption in the grid, and they managed to pull down part of the Iranian power grid. So this is just some example of these radical changes what we are seeing with these kind of new energy intensive things what we see in the grid and at the edge of the grid, and the aggregation is one part of that. So going into the topic of the public internet connectivity. So currently, I mean, when we first developed the public internet, it was never developed to be kind of like an always on reliable network. It was more like a best effort network, which was kind of like all the security things and the availability things have been we have been developing afterwards, because the basic principle of the internet is quite unreliable in that sense. So there is lots of services what we are using, and we are just building those services on top of the internet, and we don't quite fully always grasp that it's kind of like what would happen if we wouldn't have any internet. And some example of this, which was not directly related to the internet being down, was, for example, the Amazon web services when they had some issues, and there was some obviously the devices which were at home lost the connection to the cloud, and people's vacuum cleaners and doorbells stopped working. This would have very well been like a problem with the internet connection, not only the cloud connection. So this is kind of like an example that if we build more and more things which are reliant that the internet is working, especially for the services which needs to be 24/7 up and running, there is some kind of like risk which is growing bigger and bigger, and which then might cause very unexpected consequences if we are not actually understanding the risk which is developing. So when we talk about aggregating these energy assets over the internet, of course the issue is not if you aggregate few megawatts of pool over the internet, because that doesn't still cause any issues with the grid if in case somebody manages to take control of that. And the control can be taken by not only a cyber attack, it can be a vulnerability or bug in the software, or it can be a human mistake. It can be something. Not only a cyber attack is a possible source for this one. But when we reach the capacity of the gigawatts, these actually become a risk to your critical infrastructure. If in case somebody gets or manages to control the whole pool of that energy. So what kind of risks, like I mentioned in the earlier slide, that ENGIE-tiko is providing an alternative option to connect through the private mobile connection using a SIM card, which we recommend for the large scale installations. So how is that more secure compared to the internet? So denial of service attacks is something that has been steadily rising. Again, there was a little bit of like a slow moment with the denial of service a few years ago, and now it's rising again. And there's a big number of these ransom-related denial of service attacks as well. So attackers are actually trying to find these companies who are very much relying on the availability of the internet, and then they are sending a ransom message to the company and say that if you don't pay this ransom, then otherwise we will DDoS your aggregation point, or whichever is the critical bottleneck of your ecosystem. So, and they are especially targeting these companies which are relying on always on internet connection, and there is no 100% secure way for defending against these kind of denial of service attacks. There's only ways to mitigate those, but you can never get rid of these attacks unless you separate your connection from the internet completely. The other things that which are still very difficult to defend against in internet is the DNS, which is the address book of the internet. So somebody might hijack your DNS connections if you're relying on the DNS, and effectively you can lose the whole control and the visibility to your pool if your DNS is not working. The other thing which is also something that internet was never designed to be kind of like protected against was the BGP attack. So somebody can actually hijack your BGP, which is the core routing protocol of the internet, and then effectively cause a whole network to go down, which is usually the obvious single point of failure is your aggregation point. So both these, the denial of service attacks and the DNS attacks, have been steadily rising already in 2020. And there was also just recently published research that especially the energy industry is a high value, the highest value target for the attackers currently. So the attackers are especially targeting the energy industry because they know that the energy industry is digitalizing very quickly, and is a valuable target for them in that sense. So how do you mitigate against these kind of things? It's more about, like I said, it's about the size of your pool. So in case you have a small sizes, I wouldn't consider that as a big threat yet. But if you have a size of hundreds of megawatts, or it's closing like a gigawatt capacity, then you would need to think that what would happen if I don't have the internet available? If there's something, if it's a DDoS attack or something else, do I have any other ways to keep my services up and running? So this is kind of like more like a risk analysis, what you have to include in your business. Then jumping into the home networks. So this is kind of like a short evolution, what has been happening in the home networks within the last, let's say, 15 years. First of all, we had just few devices in the home networks. We had a computer, we might have a printer there, some laptops. Then what happened was the Internet of Things. We started to have all this kind of things with a smart prefix on them. So we have smart locks, we have smart speakers, we have smart baby monitors, robot cleaners, and now what we see happening is we start to see these high energy capacity IoT assets also connected to these home networks. So as we can see that the home networks have been growing quite steadily, and not only steadily, I think that's also an exponential growth, almost what we see in there. So these have become quite, let's say, interesting environments and containing a lot of also high value targets for the attackers. So if you compromise one single asset in that network, it's always a route, and you can use that to jump to other devices in your networks. So we have started already to think about not only regarding the high energy capacity assets that can and should you keep these devices all in the same networks, and if you keep these devices in the same networks, what kind of threats there might be for the assets you have in there. So there was a study, I think, recently that compared to the 2020, within the next 5 years, the average number of these IoT assets in your home networks would probably triple by 2025. So that's and that's including all the IoT assets, not only the high energy capacity assets. So if you connect these into the same home routers, there was also kind of like a research, I think this was from Trend Micro, that the home routers would actually be the most valuable target for cyber attackers in 2021, because when you get an access to this home router, that's a pathway to all the assets what you have in your home networks. So this is kind of like something that we already see that the attackers start to see the value in the home networks, and they would target their attacks towards the households and the assets which are in there. So what are the mitigations for this? the basic principle is obviously that whatever you connect to these home networks, you should consider these networks to be untrusted and hostile places. So you should consider that it would be the same thing as connecting almost to the internet if you put something in your home network. And there's this kind of new concept called zero trust, which is pretty much the same principle of not trusting the network where you connect to. So you don't consider that, okay, it's your home network, it's safe, you can keep few ports open and you can have it kind of like a little bit less secure because it's still behind your router, and most likely you should have a firewall in there. But zero trust is something that whatever you put into some location in your network, you would already consider that it would be attacked. So this is something what we do with our gateway device. So even though you can still use the home gateway for the connection to the cloud, we still consider that you should never keep any ports open in that device, and it's as hostile place as the internet is. And then we bundle all the high energy assets behind that device, which is the secure enclave for these assets. And the one thing what you need to keep in mind as well is that when the basic principle of the cybersecurity is that if you cannot ensure the physical security of the device, it's very difficult to ensure anything else on top of that. So the physical security is the prerequisite for any kind of cybersecurity. So you have to remember that these devices are always in the households, which is out of your control in the sense of that you cannot see who is actually visiting your devices or who is trying to tamper those. So you need to have some basic tamper resistance mechanisms built in there. And you should always consider that any of these devices which you have on the edge of the network could be somehow tampered, because somebody might have a physical access and somebody might want to try to do something with those devices. So you need to have some mechanisms to actually monitor that if one of your devices in your pool is starting to somehow behave a little bit weird, or there's some kind of change in the pattern how this device is acting, and you need to be able to protect your central cloud for any misbehaving asset on the edge, and you should be able to exclude that asset from the pool so it doesn't cause any bigger issues in your overall pool of assets. So the central cloud has to be protected from one single node, which is on the edge of the network. So that's the principle. So this was a little bit of like a quick scratch on these topics. I'm more than happy to discuss a little bit deeper for these any of these areas. But the 3+1 takeaways from this presentation is kind of like the part where Remi said. I think the highlight from that is that you want to keep your PII separate from any operational data, and you want to keep those in different places and have security mechanisms around those with the means of anonymization or pseudonymization of the data. And the second point is that understanding the aggregation risks, understanding the amount of the capacity you have aggregated, and then seeing that, okay, in which point it actually starts to become so large pool that if I lose the connectivity over the internet, do I have some backup mechanisms for the connection or the control or the monitoring of the pool? Third thing is adapting these new models of thinking how to build your cybersecurity, including the zero trust. That whichever place it is, whichever network it is, that you assume that most likely somebody will try to attack that one. So you don't have these safe places where you think that, okay, when I put it into this corner, it will be most likely safe you kind of like need to lose that thinking mode, and you need to assume that whichever place it is, how secure it might seem, somebody will try to attack that one. And then you build the end-to-end visibility and the control over the central over the pipeline, so you can see the anomalies and the deviations in your pool. And the last part is obviously the regulation. How do we actually make sure that everyone is understanding these topics in the same way and understanding the risks in the same way? So we've been having a lot of conversation on a European Union level, and there's a very good work happening on that area, but that work has to be published quite quickly before we start to see these kind of like aggregations and different ways how people are and companies are building these things, because it will be very difficult to manage after it grows over a certain point. So I think we really need the regulation to actually to decide what are the principles for protecting these kind of new models, VPPs and home energy management systems. So that ends my presentation. I think we have a now Q&A starting up. So
okay, Tariff, thank you very much for the good presentation, also for the previous ones on Morgan's and Remi. So we have already some questions in the Q&A. So right now, it's a good opportunity for those that didn't post their questions to do so on the Q&A or to raise their hands so we can pass on the live feed to the participants. So I'll start perhaps with the first question we have here from Julia from the JRC. Which is basically questions related to the use of the terms that were somehow related to the presentation here. So their question is if the terms are derived from the harmonized electricity market model, where some of these roles are defined. And I would add on top of that, if it's being related or not, in your view, what's the importance of harmonizing some of these points here in this topic? So I don't know if either Remi or you, Tony, want to answer this?
I can answer. So no, we did not use terms from the harmonized electricity market model. Unfortunately, I agree that in those terms, it would be nice to have everyone use the same terms, but as always, as we see on different norms and different sources, it's always difficult to let's say harmonize everything. But yeah, there are similar rules in the harmonized electricity market model that are in the end kind of easily identifiable with the one that we just presented.
But did you recognize the importance of harmonizing this at the EU level?
Yeah, I can comment on that one. Yeah, I see this as one of the main challenges. Like if I consider the last year already, the different terminology what we have been using. Of course, there is things happening on the North America, things happening on European Union, and everyone is using a little bit different terminology on this one. So it's really challenging to actually it's probably telling that how fast this industry is moving forward, because the standardization of this kind of terminology is quite diverse currently. So I think this is one of the most important topics that we start to speak the same language around this.
Okay, thank you very much. Then for the second question that we have here from a colleague of ours, so from Philippe, which is regarding the separation of data. So even if data is separated, is there a system actor that can relate both databases? So the question here is basically on the inference that you can get from data from one side or the other and to collect additional information. So something on the limits of the bare minimum data that you can have to produce any kind of services. So there's also a way to perhaps relate or extract additional information that may pose some challenges here. So how do you comment about this?
So yes, it is possible that there is an actor that can relate both databases, and it's actually needed because, for example, for the customer app, they want to see their consumption. So the two tables, the databases, need to be both joined to show the appropriate data to the customer. But for everything, every service that uses this data, let's say all together, for example, for the virtual power plant, they only have access to one database. So they, if they need any information from the other one, they either need to ask from a different path, or they cannot. They can only have access to this database. But it's since it's created, it's not completely encrypted, because we need to be able to, in one way, get access to the consumption data. But the other way, it's blocked. If you have only the access to the consumption data, you cannot have access to the first database. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you. So to the next one from a colleague of ours too, from Sonai, which is regarding more on the technology front. So in terms of the protocols and sensors, if any are on the radar for acquiring information from electrical signature of appliances. So basically, I believe that this question is more related with the ability to extract additional information from either disaggregating the information from existing appliances and systems that can better identify or somehow identify patterns of uses of energy within your household, which again can conflict a bit on the privacy and the fact that you may not want to disclose that information to third parties. So also from your side, how is ENGIE and ENGIE-tiko in particular looking at this?
So we know that this type of technology exists and is being developed. We don't do that at ENGie-tiko, because we actually have, for each asset, have a meter and actuator that controls the asset, that is separated. So we don't want to recreate this data, because our goal is to control everything that we measure. So it's not really in our vision right now. So from us, the answer is no. We actually don't need that to control the devices, but indeed it's a privacy concerns for the customers. So it depends on the hardware installed. So with machine learning technique, it's becoming easier and easier, even with hardware that is not very precise, to determine this data. And right now at ENGie-tiko, this is not our goal, but we know that some actors in the industry offer these services and some people want them. But as you say, it can be worrying if some people do that without the acknowledgement from the customer, and without the customer wanting the utility to do that. So that's why, for example, in France, where we mainly work, there are laws to prevent that. For example, from the home meter, the ENGIE meter that is installed in every house, there's a minimum resolution that is set to 30 minutes, because according to the actors of the French and regulators of the French sector, they believe that with only 30 minutes resolution, you cannot extract the data, enough data to rebuild that. So there are some laws on that. And if you want to install a system that is more precise than that, you have to have a purpose that is clearly explained to the customer, and that is clearly shown that you won't do that behind their back. Otherwise, it's illegal. So I cannot say for the whole European Union. I believe it's relatively the same. And I believe it's good that laws are already thought to prevent that. But unfortunately, you never know what malicious companies, if they lie, you never know what can happen.
Yeah, data is a commodity, and nowadays actually something with a potential high value. So there's also left a bit to the companies within their profiles to ensure that this is done the right way, and not only in terms of the part where the seriousness is upheld to, but also to the fact that the consumer is always informed of the actions that are made. So pretty good on that front. So that's also a larger discussion, I believe, but let's go through the other questions we have here so we can also resume to this one if necessary. So we have a question from George Ponescu from the DG and Air. So his question is more related from the energy front. So, and he's posing this question, is the control system working within existing systems? I mean, a smart thermostat, and building on top of those, or is actually replacing them? So a bit of a question to how is this implementation done in terms of existing systems, legacy, otherwise, and smart systems. So how do you see this interaction between what already exists and what's actually being developed as the new smart systems and actuators?
Yes, so we see everything on the market right now. So new systems to replace old systems, as you say. So smart thermostat replace an old thermostat, or a new, let's say, smart grid ready heat pump to replace an old heat pump. At TICO, we actually believe that it's a bit, I don't want to say, yeah, we believe that it's too bad to replace everything if it still works. And that goes a bit against the idea of not using too much energy. So our goal is to have a small add-on, and that is retrofit and works on anything. That's actually what we do. So for example, in France with electric heaters, we are actually able to control any electric heater, whether they are super old or new from last month. It's the same with heat pumps. If they're smart grid ready or old from 20 years old, we can control them. The goal is that any device that is still viable and can live for a couple of years or the next 20 years, we can control it in order not to replace it, and also have a cheaper solution, because buying a whole new system is more expensive. So we want for any system to build on top of this and to adapt to what's coming. So for example, systems that don't really, I mean, they exist right now, but they're not widespread. For example, EV chargers. The challenge is to find the best technology to interact with them and be future-proof to any charger in the future. So it's not retrofit, but it's on the opposite, like future fit, let's say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next question from a colleague of ours, so Vasco Dias from our front. He's asking if you could develop a bit further on the privacy design controls for ensuring that there's fair usage on the measurement data. So also related to the previous topic that we were discussing too, but how do you see that this fair access to data does not jeopardize or does not compromise the frontier in which the users have the right to be informed and the right to have their information used for the fair use of a service?
On that, on fair usage of the measurement, I'm just thinking how to answer the question. I think what we do is that we tell the customer basically everything that we do with the data. So if by fair usage you mean that the customer is always aware that how their data are used and what they can do to their data, we believe that we need to have in the contract, so first clearly explain what we do with the data, but then not only in the contracts, but in real life, in production, but in operation, what's happening. So for example, in the customer app, if we use a device from a customer to provide a service to a TSO, we'll tell them. So they will see it in their consumption patterns. They will see, for example, a point or information bar telling them, oh, we have used your device. We also give them feedback on what we have done as provided to the grid. So for example, there's different measurements that we want to, and metrics that we want to implement to tell them, thanks to you, we were allowed to reduce the peak of consumption that prevented the use of fossil fuels for the grid. So we try to be as transparent as possible with the customer on what their data is used for. So the goal is that we don't sell the
I
data.
have one, sorry to interrupt you, I have one subsequent question to what you're saying, which is even if you provide fair access and clear, let's say, information to the user, there's always this discussion on if by having too much information in the public domain, which whenever concerns privacy should be there, that's not a discussion, but some of the information also entails part of it, some of the, let's say, market advantage for a service. And in some point, all of us, we are users of energy at our household. So, and you may have your competition also looking at your services. So is there a risk? Is there a thin line that it's hard to circumvent?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the point. Is that the data is...
If you're informing everyone that you're using data for a certain purpose, you may also revealing a bit more the information about the service that you may have advantage over your competitor. And although whenever it reaches out to the point of privacy, it should be public domain. That's not the debate. But there's also the frontier where companies may not be willing to disclose that information without disclosing that they're developing a specific service that someone else can also compete with.
So we don't share the data that we have. So this data is not shared at all, but we share what we do with it, what we offer with it. So it's true that some companies are quite, how do you say, opaque to what they offer as services, but we believe that there's no need to do that, and that any service that we offer, and we can make public what is the end goal of our systems. But how exactly we use the data is obviously private, because we don't disclose how we use it exactly, because that's what makes our business. And also the data is not shared or sold whatsoever, so cannot be used by other companies.
Okay, let's move on to the next question, a bit more on technical front, also from Philippe from ENGIE-tiko, which is with regards with IPv6, all devices have public addresses, and in principle, the role of home routers, so it makes like the devices are much more exposed than before. So do you think that technically this integration with IPv6 will introduce an even more increasing issue with the security points? So I don't know, Tony, if you can answer to this one. What's your view on this?
So in principle, the IPv6 shouldn't change much things. I mean, the security issues with IPv4 and IPv6 are 90% similar, and you still have to make sure that, like I mentioned, that whatever you connect to any network, whether it's a home or directly to the internet, you need to make sure that it's secure, and you need to do some pen testing, that there are no open ports or vulnerabilities. So the IPv6, even though I would personally like to change to the IPv6 completely, but unfortunately we have been trying to do that for the last 20 years, and it's still probably not going to happen in anytime soon. So IPv6 is a positive thing in itself, and it doesn't change that much of the how do you secure your devices. It's mainly more highlighting that you actually need to make sure and understand the zero trust model, that whatever you plug in to any network, it will get attacked, whether it's IPv4 or IPv6. So in that sense, it's not changing the threat.
Yeah, you raised one point at your presentation, which is we can always assume that the system is secure to the point that it's not secure anymore. So IPv6, IPv4, we should always assume that there is always someone looking on ways to circumvent this insecurity. Either way, IPv4 still exists because we have been quite creative on still keeping IPv4 as usable. So IPv6 is there anytime soon. Okay, thank you very much. There's a bit of a different question from Frank, which is related with PII protection, cybersecurity, and the adoption of user devices and critical mass is crucial for business model of a VPP. So how do you achieve access to a lot of devices? So The question here comes to a point, I believe, on the massification on the use of devices, and the fact that for some business cases or use cases, we rely on a lot of information being available. So I don't know if either you, Tony, or Remi, you could comment on this.
Just a second, if I understood the question correctly. So is this kind of like so?
It has to do with the massification, I believe, with the devices in order to support business models such as the VPP. So how do you ensure that even by having a lot of these devices, that these issues related with cybersecurity and protection of data still hold?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, like everything starts from the risk assessment, and then kind of like obviously when these data storages, they grow bigger and bigger and bigger, the more risk there will be, and better controls you need to put around them. So I think it's just one approach, if I understood the question correctly, one approach is what I would also recommend is if you think about the VPP, so putting some kind of maximum limits for certain capacity, that beyond this point you need to have some kind of redundancy in there. So if this one pool will somebody gains a control of or if there's a cyber attack, whether it's a PII information or whether it's operation of the VPP, that doesn't actually propagate further, and you still have always some part of your overall pool available. So some approach, and this is mainly also good discussion from the regulatory perspective, that you probably could say that there's a maximum capacity your VPP can handle. Otherwise, then you have to have a different capacity and different systems to run a second pool of your VPP. So I think it's kind of like a segmentation in that sense, and decentralizing the last centralized point of the VPP, which is the central cloud aggregation. I don't know if this answered the question, but at least
it raises yet some concerns on how to approach the decentralization of computation, which is something that it's been worked in the academia and also by the industry on implementing secure solutions. So I think it raises at least the awareness and raises this topic as something to be discussed. So thank you. As a final question, because we are already beyond the schedule we had, but apparently we have people quite interested in this topic, which is always good. We have finally one question before we leave to the live session. If there's any other questions from Vash, which he introduces as a final question, which are the major regulatory burdens you have been facing so far, and if any, and which of the reforms do you think are really necessary to make sure that the business model are successfully sustained, and looking at the end user, that you have the trust from the end user side? And again, how do you think your work, or how is your work entailed together with the work done by the Commission in different working groups? So there are other questions here entailed in the introduction from Vash, but basically I think the bottom question is this one. So in your business, how you're looking at this?
Tony, if you prefer.
So I can just comment that from my perspective, there should be two track of discussions. One is related obviously to the privacy and the protection of any personal data, which is more like the EMS side of the things, and one is the critical infrastructure discussion, which is more about what kind of effects with these aggregations and whatever is happening with these new energy models might cause to the critical infrastructure. And those stakeholders are then a little bit different, and also the protection mechanisms and regulatory frameworks has to be different. So of course there is interrelationship between the privacy and then the cybersecurity of these, for example, VPP, but the ways and the means how you actually protect those two are quite different. So there needs to be two track of discussions, and the discussions have been, like, within the last year, it has been very good, and the right points have been raised a lot. So now we understand that there's risks. And the second, the more challenging step is to actually then have something on a paper and standardize it, and then have a consensus around that.
Exactly. If I may add on the consensus, it's exactly that. If we have to say one burden that we have been facing is that some rules are applied to some entities, but other entities ask for data that do not follow the rule for operation. They, for example, as I said, the CNIL said that the data from the meters in France should not be below 30 minutes, except specific cases by service providers. But then other major regulators want to have access to 10-minute data, and then there's kind of a clash between the two. One saying that they need that for their regulation, but the other saying, oh, but it's against the CNIL. And so there was some discussion that don't go forward with that. So consensus between everyone, I think, is the biggest challenge.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. So there's no other questions here. So I'll just leave out the next minutes for those willing to, or if they have any questions, do it live, so we can pass on the so to speak, the microphone. So let's check if you have any hand raised. Not yet. Okay, I believe that we have already a lot of questions. And okay, just as a reminder, first of all, to thank the speakers today for the very good presentations and for the very good discussion. So I believe that for most of us here would spend very quickly the afternoon here debating this. So thank you very much for your presentations, also for the audience and for being so contributive and so interventive with the questions. I hope that you enjoy this session. Just again, as a reminder, this will be available on the project YouTube channel. So stay tuned, that more information will be disclosed soon. So thank you very much. Wishing you all a nice day and stay safe. Bye-bye.